What is the horror genre? Guided close read. Stephen King is one of the most popular horror writers in history, and Sharon A. Russell was the first person to write a book for the general public analyzing his work. She uses her expertise in the field to analyze how the horror genre works and what makes a good horror story. An author's purpose is his or her reason for writing. Russell's likely purpose for writing this piece, based on the title of the essay, is to define the horror genre. One way to define something is by discussing what it is not. Reread lines 1 through 11. Identify the phrase in which Russell states what horror stories do not have to include. What reason does she give for beginning this way? Pause while you think. She says, not all horror deals with monsters, and offers that we all think of creatures like Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Wolfman. Horror covers more than just these monsters, to explain why she begins there. How might the author's statements relate to the central or most important idea in the literary criticism? Pause while you think. She brings up a common misunderstanding about the genre to avoid later confusion when she offers her own ideas about how to define it. When you summarize, you briefly retell the central ideas and the most important details in a piece of writing. One of the most important steps in summarizing is determining a text's main ideas. In lines 12 through 32, Russell explains one feature that can be used to define the horror genre. Reread lines 12 through 32. Summarize the main idea. Pause while you think. Readers expect something bad to happen just because the story is a horror story. Authors of literary criticism define and classify literature according to certain criteria or standards. In lines 51 through 63, Russell is identifying criteria that helps answer the question she posed in the title. What is the horror genre? Reread lines 51 through 63. Identify two types of horror stories. What is Russell's purpose for describing the two types of stories? Pause while you think. The two types Russell describes are stories that deal with parallel worlds and events seem to be supernatural but turn out to have natural explanations. This supports her central idea by helping to define what the horror genre is. Notice the author's use of the personal pronoun I in lines 65 through 67. This is the first instance of its use in this literary criticism. Reread lines 65 through 67. What is the impact of this personal detail? Pause while you think. The description of the author's experience with a classic horror story brings a more personal element into the literary criticism. It reveals that she is a fan of the genre as well as an academic person who studies and analyzes it. In lines 72 through 83, notice additional criteria for horror stories that the author examines. Here she's looking at the source of the horror. Reread lines 72 through 83. Identify two ways a person in a horror story may become a source of horror. What is the author's purpose for describing the source of horror in stories? Pause while you think. In lines 74 and 75, Russell writes, something goes wrong inside and a person turns into a monster. In lines 79 and 80, she writes, an outside force may invade the character and then force the evil out again. Russell shares these descriptions because the source of horror connects to her central idea by helping to define characteristics of the horror genre.